So Ms. Kirsten Dunlop is one of the 16 experts at the Economic and Societal Impact of Research and Innovation expert group, providing independent advice on how future EU research and innovation policy can best support sustainable development and the European Commission priorities. Kirsten's career span academia, consulting, banking, insurance, strategy, design, innovation, and leadership. Kirsten joined EIT Climate-KIC in January 2017. She is committed to developing and implementing innovation to catalyze profound systematic change, and is honored to work with Climate-KIC's world-class network of partners to support climate innovation across Europe and beyond. So welcome, Kirsten, to our conference, and we look forward to hear your speech.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I can see, or what I glimpsed, is that you are in one of the most beautiful rooms that I know. So I have a little bit of envy, beautiful room, yeah. Location envy, and I am instead substituting with a Zoom background to give me a sense of why I do what I do. So I will use some slides. I am going to take up, it's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to listen to René describing what is the kind of the framing premises of the SeeRRI partnership and the underpinning assumptions about the needs for transforming research and innovation. And I would certainly echo and really want to underline many of the claims and call to action that he is calling out. What I can bring to this is a reflection as a practitioner, as an innovation practitioner, working within the European context with a European instrument, with an organization that was created by the Commission as part of the first wave of knowledge innovation communities within the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. That has had 10, 12, 11 years, nearly 12 years of history of practice and experimentation, experience and learning, has made a set of difficult and bold choices about what it is that we bring, how we support innovation, how we define its purpose, and how we deploy it, and has done that very much actually informed by a sense of the need for reframing our understanding of what we're doing, what it's in service of, and how it can be effective. So I'm going to just give you examples of, and I think it's just very important for me to be clear, these are examples that I believe would be relevant to the discussion of what responsible research and innovation can stand for, what it's calling for. They have not come from a discourse that has been informed by knowing about that. They've actually come, and I would wish to put immediately out there that for me it's a discovery that there is a movement called responsible research and innovation, and that's actually very worrying, that I have been operating within the European context for 4.5 years, coming from the corporate environment, and this is a point of encounter in terms of, Climate-KIC supports some of the local actions. We have partners working in responsible research and innovation projects, and I will speak about one of them. But I think that's not a bad thing. I think it's just an interesting question around how do we bring together so much common ground, recognizing that it's a series of minority voices of common ground with respect to very dominant paradigms in the world about what innovation is, what it's for, and how it's effective. So take this as a practitioner's view with a couple of concrete examples of what is happening on the ground, not specifically RRI projects as such, but very much coherent with the principles that you are discussing and seeking to mobilize into action. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the slides, and just give you a couple of elements of who we are, what we are, for those of you who don't know the KICs particularly well, or EIT, or what it is that Climate-KIC is doing. We are a community organisation. We bring together over 2,000 other organisations, from very, very small startups and micro SMEs to some of the kind of core fabric of the SME structure of European economy and industry and innovation, large corporates, universities, RTOs and civil society, city governments, regional governments that are members of the Climate-KIC community. Our focus is on systemic change, and it is on how research and innovation can be effectively recast, and I'm referring to recast because that has not been the focus of innovation, the dominant models of innovation in the world, designed and deployed to catalyse systemic change, which also requires comprehension of what it means to refer to and understand and engage with systems, particularly complex adaptive systems. We set ourselves a task. We pivoted the focus of the organisation in 2017, reflecting upon what we had done in the previous 7 to 8 years and determining as a community, through our consultative process with our partners, that we should not continue to do what we had been doing for the previous 8 years, but that we should pivot the business model and the value proposition of the KIC in order to be more coherent and more commensurate with the nature of the change that we are addressing, that are needed, and the problem that we exist to serve. So we very much looked at what does climate change require, what does it mean to address climate change, what will it need, and what will it need in the next 10 years, and what should we do? Our positioning is closely following the accelerating body of scientific evidence, which points to the need to reach decarbonisation, to decarbonise en masse, to reach so-called climate neutrality by 2030, not by 2050. It's too late by 2050. And that really means also not just thinking in terms of neutrality, but actually very proactively thinking in terms of regeneration. And of course, that's why we need innovation, because we have no idea how to achieve that in those kinds of timeframes. As I mentioned, we are a very diverse network. We operate in 39 countries. So not only in Europe, these are European organizations, but operating in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, in South America. We have partnerships in Israel, in the US, in Australia, and in China. And we are looking to connect our actions and our goals around impact to a holistic, a transformative frame that is looking at climate as principally a challenge of social transformation. Social transformation, economic transformation, but changes ultimately profound transformations in the human design for life. And our concern here is how do we change our design for life to enable 10 billion people to live sustainably on this planet and with one another. So it's very much comprehending that the challenge here is intensely difficult because we are not talking about a set of accelerated technological substitutions. We are talking about changing ourselves, and that is not the same thing. So we have sought to reflect upon the dominant paradigms in research and innovation, the way in which the intended and unintended consequences that they produce, and we've reflected upon a number of things. In the European landscape, I notice, perhaps because I have come from outside of that, a tendency to think of innovation very much in terms of research or pure research, the development of ideas, and somehow the application of those ideas into the real world as being not research and innovation, as deployment. And there's an odd, I notice, at least again, please take this as my reflections of somebody coming from outside, there's almost a fastidiousness, like deployment is somehow less innovative or less relevant or less important, less of a status than research and innovation as pure research and ideas development. From my perspective, innovation is a transitive verb. It means to innovate, to create something new, to create a difference in something out there or in ourselves. And create a difference in the business, in the value chain, in a way of thinking, and above all, create a difference in our notion of what it means to live effectively. So it is absolutely intrinsic to what we are talking about when we're talking about research and innovation, that it should be used to make a difference. And that requires just as much of a focus of innovation and innovation of systems, effects, and assumptions as the development of new ideas in the first place. Secondly, we are addressing the fact that from our perspective, Innovation addressing climate change needs to comprehend the nature of the problem. And the nature of the problem is one that is inherently systemic, and not just systemic in any sense, but we are talking about complex adaptive systems, as you know better than I, in part because or above all, because we're starting with ourselves, because we need to change ourselves. And therefore, the underlying model of innovation, the paradigm, our need for innovation, is to learn, is to trigger and to build and to invest in our adaptive capacity, our ability to make sense of things, to experiment, to adopt, to change, to kind of shapeshift. And that is a very, very different set of thinking about what you're doing with innovation. And it really mobilizes this transformation from thinking of innovation as a mechanism for selection, for funneling in to choose winning solutions to solve specific problems, to shifting the entire paradigm of thinking of innovation as a way of throwing a net out, of wrangling and putting our hands into extreme uncertainty, because complex adaptive systems create for human and for human experience uncertainty, extreme uncertainty. And when we're talking about changing the entire world, transforming the human design for life on all continents and in all cultures in 9 years, we are talking about extreme uncertainty. Then there's the question of innovation needing to make meaning, to be able to construct representations and images of possibility that are meaningful enough for human communities to move towards them, which is, again, a question of emotion, of imagination, and of hyper-local, of individual relationships between identity and a changing context. And that's another thing that we need to think about how we design innovation for. And we're talking about innovation to change the system. And here there is really a shift in our practice of thinking about what are systems, how do they function, how do we design for the properties of systems and their capacity to change themselves constantly. When poked, when prodded, they move, they change by mobilizing and moving towards attractors. So how do we think about innovation to create the attractors that can produce the changes we need and can anticipate or play with or learn very fast and build an adaptive capacity in response to the consequences of those changes, which will be and are non-linear, and therefore we cannot control them. So we need to be ready and able to dance with them and to dance and change ourselves in them. And that means really intervening simultaneously. It's why we are using the approach we're using, simultaneously on the sensitive intervention points, the acupuncture points, the levers and drivers around finance, around our existing assumptions around economy and value, our underpinning belief that we have a right to dominion and to extract value from, to exploit the planet on which we're on, which is one of the root cause issues we need to change. Our notions around governance and our notions around, if you like, the underpinning, the dark matter of what we actually invest in, which in a European context, for example, is equilibrium, stasis, and kind of risk mitigation, as opposed to transformation. I think that's very much what René was referring to. So we chose to put this into practice in a beta form at the beginning of 2019 by launching the notion of deep demonstrations, very much because we were seeking to trigger this idea that seeing, for human systems, representation matters. Seeing is believing. We need to see possibility at scale, to engage with it as something tangible and real. And our biggest challenge is living labs in university campuses are not sufficient to help policymakers, regulators, decision makers, citizens comprehend the scale of transformation that an entire city decarbonising and becoming more climate resilient and adaptive would require. So we launched an invitation to what we call challenge owners, to city governments, to regional governments, to national governments, and to corporations embedded in large regional or global value chains to work with us on deploying, on harnessing the power of innovation to accelerate learning about how to achieve systemic change, large-scale, whole system, whole city, whole agricultural area, whole community change. We have 25 partnerships at the moment at very, very, very different kind of stages of development. We are continuing to support, as an organisation, the development of new ideas, new business models, new technologies, the supply of innovation, but we plug that together into contexts. And I'm going to give you an example of what does that look like in practice. One of the areas that we work on is in urban transformation. This is where we are seeking to create, first of all, an underpinning construct of innovation as a mechanism for accelerated, de-risked experimentation and learning. This is about using innovation to generate options, to see possibilities, and particularly to look for the properties of things we haven't understood or even begun to understand, in the way in which we learn from nature through biomimicry, nature-based solutions, the way in which we can combine solutions for needs that we don't treat in similar ways because they're structured into our mechanistic compartmental thinking. So, for example, digital technology needed to make houses more energy efficient is the same digital technology that we need for in-home healthcare. And rewilding solutions often solve for air pollution, mobility, transport, but also for social cohesion and community well-being at the same time. We run them separately because we have sectoral departments, we have separated budget lines, we don't think of putting them together. This approach is about building a portfolio environment, a place-based real economy portfolio environment that deliberately chooses innovations because of their inherent or potential relationships, synergies, combinations, and so on. Madrid is one example, one of the cities where we're doing this. I'm sorry the resolution on this image is not so good. This gives you a little bit of an example of the kind of portfolio work where we are putting a frame around multiple needs of the city, starting with what it is the city would need to actually fully decarbonise and think about adaptation and resilience, and then creating a portfolio frame to help the city pull together the many different initiatives it already has, and running a process of reconnaissance. This just gives you a sense of the way in which the process is working. Starting by agreeing not on objectives, because they tend to tie back into the categorical thinking that we have, where our budgets are fixed and our businesses work in sectors and silos and so on, but to really try to understand the problem space and think about an ambition and an intent with respect to it, and an intent that can be held over time. Secondly, to really seek to map and understand the systemic nature of the things that we need to change. In Madrid, air quality is a huge issue, transport design and mobility is a massive issue, social cohesion, dealing with immigration, and questions of inequality or fuel poverty for cooling is a huge issue. Heat stress, the lack of organic material, kind of the loss of the city's traditional physical footprint in the way in which nature-based solutions can help with heat and water. Many of those things need to be addressed together. And the regulatory frameworks do not lend themselves, so we need a regulatory sandbox. So we have looked at intervention points, the systems at stake, and so on. And then really looking to create, as I was showing you, a portfolio construct. The idea that innovation here is about connecting many different types of solutions, addressing different possibilities for catalysing change, different levers, intervention points, and so on, and deploying them simultaneously while running a constant process of reconnaissance, looking out. What are we learning here? What do we see as a gap? We didn't realise that we needed to think about this thing. Who is doing something in the world on that? Could we plug that in? Or let's look at what's going on over here in a completely different field that could be relevant to the way we're thinking about rainwater capture or moss and algae. Or is there something happening in health technology? And so on. And then, most important of all, this is a learning system. This is about running innovation in such a way that we are directly, actively mining, building and generating meaning and understanding from the experience of innovation so that we can connect it up to policy making, to regulation, understanding where our innovations are beginning to work or where there is a strong community propensity and willingness to engage, to participate, to co-own, to co-determine, but it's just not possible because of a set of policies that were created for completely different intentions 20, 30, 50 years ago and need to be changed, and so on. And where and how to direct resource, capital, and so on. We have a chance now. Tomorrow, the Net Zero Cities program will launch as the prototype, the kind of pilot for the city mission, one of the 4 or 5 missions the European Commission is launching. We have a chance now to pilot, to prototype, to accelerate the way in which this kind of systemic approach on the ground, place-based portfolio building within cities can help us accelerate learning how to change the way capital comes in and public and private finance comes in behind a systemic approach to innovation, and innovation is learning. And to change or learn how to bring policy closer together, how to close the bridge between so many of our good intentions that are nonetheless pulling in different directions, and how to create the training data for a very, very different set of paradigm around what research and innovation is for and how it can have an effect. Another example of this kind of work is focused on climate adaptation and resiliency. Here, very much at the core of understanding that climate is a social change problem, it's a social transformation opportunity. It is absolutely wired into the heart of complex, wicked problems, of very, very deeply conflicted interests and needs, of polarities, and of a lack of understanding of the fact that polarities are about interdependencies. We need to work out how to deal with them in systemic terms, not try to polarize and separate and kind of binarize them, but really understand on the ground, how do we deal with governance of the commons? How are we going to deal with the risks and breakdown to mental and social resilience that then completely collapses our adaptive capacity to think about new business models or to implement and try new things? How do we husband? How do we steward? How do we come up with solutions that are fundamentally about our own capability more than anything else? Amongst these various regions, let me just give you the example of Glasgow, since we're coming up to COP. Glasgow has now published its adaptation strategy, and it's very much based on this kind of work. And what's interesting here is we made a decision very early on with the local stakeholders not to go where all of the existing work had already been, which was principally on flooding, but to try work more from the ground up and from the edges in, thinking and focusing therefore on heat. There's a huge issue on energy poverty, social economic issue on energy poverty, on health, huge issues in public health, individual, community, and broadly, and on well-being. And then gradually looking at how could finance come in. So using elements which were less about the kind of sort of scientific focus of what adaptation and climate services are about, and more about a question of social cohesion, of meaningful change, and of the meaning of resilience in social systems, and how that would then build back up to what the city is facing in terms of climate change effects. We developed a number of social network maps of stakeholders using a bespoke analysis approach that was built with and informed by the communities we're working with. We were looking therefore at types of actors, at relationships, at power structures, and we were looking at, and we saw very quickly incredibly strong interconnections between, not surprisingly, many of the substantive issues like housing or building stock, but in land use, in nature-based solutions, air quality, agriculture, cultural connections, questions of mechanisms for community empowerment, what had been tried or not tried, or what had failed in the past, and memory around that, power structures, and infrastructure. So what we ended up creating and designing was a suite of actions that start kind of playing with incremental to transformational in oscillation cycles and shifting climate risk out to a much larger question around sustainable development and meaningful transformation of the urban environment that is distinctive and real. And then that combined with economic cases for action so that we could continue to speak a language that investors or grant and donors could understand. And this is now published, it's going into action, it has had a huge, I think, galvanizing effect in the run-up to COP, and is a good test study for now what do we do to catalyse in the kind of financial resources that are needed to mobilise to support that kind of portfolio. Many of the co-designers are the reasons why this portfolio approach was so much more kind of nuanced and grounded in a sense of value-based, value-driven or mission-driven approaches to transformation. So supported designers coming in with a lot of experience in experimenting in complex systems, thinking in terms of social simulation, participatory processes, but also creative arts and design, and really trying to think about how do we unlock our capacity for decision-making that is inherently emotional, limbic, not rational, and harness that in understanding what we're doing. And very much working with anticipatory and polycentric governance, since we are fundamentally dealing with governance of the commons. We have a number of learnings so far, and this is in the scheme of things very, very, very short time frames, 18 months of kind of learning on how to mobilise around that first phase of securing an intent and understanding where to use innovation and what for. Now it will move into a portfolio phase. But just I would pull out a couple of things, not kind of shifting away from the emergency framing to really grounding in hope and aspiration and meaning, a relationship between identity and its context and how that context changes. Using examples and metaphors constantly to introduce the principle of systems change that people understand inherently, block out rationally because it sounds difficult and complicated, but actually inherently live it on a daily basis in any family context. And recognise how critical it is to braid in and work with and harness local alliances so that research and innovation leaves a sort of dry and technical or academic environment and becomes a very real and meaningful set of constant choices and trade-offs and discussions and debates, always framed within the context of what is this in service of, what are the problems we're dealing, what are the gaps, what kinds of transformation choices do we look at. And then just one final example. This is an early stage process. This is in partnership with the Diputación Foral de Guipúzcoa. It's in the Basque region. This is an extraordinary encounter between a regional government that is running a program that is about enabling this region in the Basque part of Spain, to become the area that has the highest level of social equality in the world, with a deep interest, if you see on that vertical axis, in experimenting with the community and engaging on mechanisms and forms of equality and solidarity, transformation done through and by a process of social cohesion, of deep listening, of deliberative participatory decision-making and ownership. It's an area that has an extraordinary history of collective structures of ownership and governance for every business, for its universities, at scale, very profitable, and pretty much defying every textbook that says that that's not possible. The work that we have been doing with them is to take that body of work and partner together to understand how to bring it into a more systemic set of engagements where the relationships between projects in, say, migrants or women or natural languages and so on are more and more inherently connected, and to connect it then to the context of climate decarbonisation, of climate adaptation, and of the decarbonisation of major industries that are connected into global value chains, and begin to use a way of working together to construct a portfolio that opens up more questions than answers, but creates a framework for the application of research and innovation. And I'm going to finish with one of the projects that is in the Climate-KIC portfolio connected specifically to the SeeRRI, to the RRI movement. That is the Supermari project supported with Climate-KIC partners. And here I think it's really just a making a connection between practice on the ground and the capacity to capture meaning, learning, to generate knowledge from that, and to make sure that that knowledge is scaled outwards and can be scaled downwards. Because so often we have a language and a notion that innovation is all about winning ideas, going on heroes' journeys, connecting with capital, pushing out into the capital markets that will somehow magically solve our problems for us, and acting in a kind of a self-referential way. I think here we need to really shift our practice of understanding and using innovation to experiment, to tap into and build our human capacities for learning, the most powerful gift we have, and to do so through the understanding that the provision of knowledge and the scaling down of solutions to the point where they are meaningful in individual places and in collective networks is very much about generating knowledge that can hold simultaneously principles that are relevant in many places and distinctive points of identity that are specific to one. We can hold those together. We're perfectly capable of doing it. We just need to kind of step back and abstract that complexity up to something that is structural enough to understand and to build platforms around. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much. I hope that you can hear the big applause here from the audience. And thanks so much for the excellent presentation. The future sounds more exciting and promising for me when I hear that we have such a systemic approach for innovation and deep transformation in Europe in place, at least in the way of thinking. And we hope that you can share with us the presentation later. It's a very important presentation which we hope more people would know about it and to learn from you and the systemic transformation effort. In the last slide, you mentioned the Supermari, and I want to confirm with you that, yes, we have the collaborative network with all the RRI projects, including Supermari. And together, we have formed the RRI ecosystem projects. Also, we have the SWAP 14 project, where we look at RRI change in territorial level. And we have so many questions for you, but considering the time limit, I will ask you only one question, which is sent from the audience. You mentioned the need for a new model of innovation. How can we convince innovation actors, especially private actors, to buy into the new model? What if they continue business as usual? Do you have any insight?
Yes. So I came to working on climate in a European context and within a public space from industry, where I was working in financial services and insurance for many, many years. And my experience is that in private industry, large scale, actually there is a much, much deeper understanding that innovation, as we conceive of it, if I call it, I'm going to make a very crude statement here, but the notion of innovation in the Silicon Valley model, kind of welcome a bunch of ideas, funnel in, use criteria to select them that are mostly around recognizable or predictable profit or benefit or kind of competitiveness in a market construct in order to attract capital. Large-scale industries know that model doesn't help them change their core business models. And most large-scale businesses have, the penny is dropping or has dropped some time ago, that climate change, just as one aspect of radical transformation and disruptive change in the world, is going to seriously pull the rug out from most core business models. The challenge is not a willingness to let go and embrace different ways of thinking about innovation. The challenge there is about models ready, methodologies ready, and the capability to support it and service it. I have ironically found that the world of public finance, both on the philanthropic side and in terms of institutional finance, is significantly more attached to the idea of innovation as kind of individual, competing, commercially successful than, unfortunately, a lot of private industry where there is a recognition that we need to fundamentally change the structures. My personal, well, let's just say this, the choices that we are making as an organisation is to put into practice the alternatives and demonstrate what they do. Because I think theoretical debates about what is right and what is wrong are just going to lose us way too much time. The quicker we put something on the ground, the quicker we can draw industry in, because it makes it more meaningful for industry to participate in something where they see this is about making new markets. The more relevant it is for cities who are already, for example, feeling incredibly accountable, the more accessible it is for farming communities, the more we start to build the training data for alternative ways of thinking about research and innovation.
Thank you very much for your answer. And again, thanks for your excellent presentation. We look forward to posting the clip, your speech and the video online on the SeeRRI conference website so that everyone can learn from your presentation and also your excellent idea of systematic change today. Thank you again. And
pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now's the time for coffee. We know we are a little bit late in terms of, in the timing. It's okay. I think it's, we will try to get, or gain 15 minutes. So instead of a 45-minute break, it's going to be a 30-minute break. So I will invite you to go downstairs, enjoy the coffee, and at the same time, we have our artwork, of the project that the artwork we have been developing during the project life. We really invite you to go and enjoy it and provide feedback if you have any at some point. Thank you.